So it's a special pleasure for me to introduce Yonat. Yonat is currently a postdoc at Cambridge, and in a couple of weeks she's starting to teach with us at Hebrew University. So that's even more of a pleasure for me. But Yonat, it is our privilege to hear from you about empathy, siblings.
So thank you so much, Judah, for the kind introduction. I'm also very excited to start teach in Israel, and actually that's my first talk in Israel for a few years. So very excited to be here. A bit nervous too, so wish me luck. And I want to share with you today some of my work about siblings in the context of autism. And the project I will present today is focused on a question I was interested in together with my colleagues at the Autism Research Center at Cambridge University. Does having a sibling affect autistic people's empathy? We know that growing up with siblings offers children exposure to social cognitive growth contexts. I'm sure all parents in the audience can relate and think of some examples of contexts such as shared imaginative play, handling conflicts, practicing reciprocal interaction. And indeed, we see in the literature that siblings' interaction in childhood are important for typical social development in various domains, including language development, theory of mind, and empathy. Siblings begin as play partners in early childhood, but throughout life they can become a source of support. And such roles might be particularly essential for autistic individuals who are likely to experience challenges throughout life in the social domain. So is it like Disney taught us in 2013? Sibling relationship will help us to grow and develop and overcome everything. So actually, it's not that straightforward, as you know. We all know also the powerful myth about how devastating and harmful can be a conflict between siblings and siblings' rivalry. So here is a drawing of Cain and Abel, maybe the most extreme example of such conflicts, and I'm sure you all can think of less extreme and more daily example for that. And as siblings also compete over resources, such as, for example, parental attention and care, a competing theory suggesting a benefit to development from siblingship would suggest a negative effect, maybe, from having a sibling on development through a process of resource dilution. And also, while we talk today about siblings and disability or siblings or autism, we also have to keep in mind that the quality of relationship sometimes matter more than its mere existence. But overall, in the social cognitive domain, we see in research more support for the positive effect hypothesis rather than the alternative resource dilution theory when it comes to typical development, as well as for children on the autism spectrum and their siblings, as it was quite beautifully captured by this illustration from a paper that was written for children and reviewed by children, summarizing the literature on autistic children and their siblings. And interestingly, we know from my work, my previous work as well as others, that there are evidence for enhanced empathy in siblings of children with disabilities, and particularly siblings of autistic children. I'm sure you can think of some explanations to that interesting finding. We will come back to it in the discussion. For now, let's focus on the autistic individual in the sibling relationship. So, how is the autistic child or individual is impacted by having a sibling, by growing up with a sibling? We learned from previous research that having a sibling is associated with better social functioning in autistic children, and also faster growth rates in adaptive behavior from childhood to adulthood in autistic individuals. And some explanations to this finding might be modeling by the siblings or a generally collaborative and accepting social environment to practice social communicational skills. Those might be explanations for this finding. In this project, we wanted to see if this positive effect replicates also specifically for empathy. And by empathy here, what we mean is the ability to imagine or recognize another person's mental states and the drive to respond to this with an appropriate or similar emotion. We used data collected from the Cambridge Autism Research Database, the CARD. We looked at two quite large cohorts of autistic children and autistic adults that were each divided into two groups, with siblings or without siblings, and those groups were compared on empathy measures. And our hypothesis was that, in line with literature, autistic people with siblings would score higher on empathy measures compared to those with no siblings. The measures of empathy we had for children were the questionnaire. Many of you are probably familiar with it. This is the empathy question, the EQ child, which is an age-appropriate version of the questionnaire designed to measure trait empathy with various questions directed to the parents on how their child is able to understand other people's mental states and relate to them. And that was, of course, a parent report. And for the adults, we had both the adult version of the EQ, which is a self-report version, and a behavioral task, the reading the mind in the eye task, that, again, some of you are probably familiar with from research. This is a 36-item task, requires participants to infer mental states solely from photos of the person's eyes. So participants are presented with a photograph of the eyes region, and then they have to choose a correct answer from 4 options to describe the mental state experienced with the eyes. Every correct answer is a score, and that is 1 point, and the score, the RMET score, is the sum of correct answers. So what did we see? Contrary to our hypothesis, and quite in sharp contrast with literature, autistic children without siblings scored higher on the EQ child, on the empathy measure, compared with those with siblings. So that was quite interesting. And we did see other replications for what we usually see in the literature, such as sex differences with females scoring higher than males, what we usually see, and there was no interaction effect. So that effect also held for dividing the siblings according to a birth order. So either if you had an older sibling or a younger sibling, that didn't matter for the score. You were scored lower by your parents. For the adults, however, results indicated no difference between autistic adults with or without siblings on the self-reported EQ or on their performance on the behavioral task designed to measure cognitive empathy. But in the RMAT, we did see an interaction effect with a quite small effect size between sex and group. And looking at the data, it was interesting to see that while autistic females scored higher than autistic males on both the EQ and the RMET, autistic males with siblings performed similarly to females on the RMET. So these results, as you can see, indicate no overall difference in empathy between autistic adults with and without siblings. Also consistent with previous literature, we did see the sex differences on these specific measures. And similarly to finding from typical population, we saw that having siblings might positively affect specifically autistic males' empathy and not females. So that might be maybe because autistic males might be more influenced by the growing up with the siblings on their social development, or maybe that females have also other resources that less affect males. But however, these are quite speculative hypotheses, and future research should directly examine them. But what is going on with the children's results? I give you time to think of an answer. That's also because my slides are stuck, but let's give it a try. So, okay, hi, Cody. So, if you remember, I shared with you that the empathy question in the child version is a parent report. So it could be that autistic children's empathic abilities are underestimated by their parents when they have siblings to whom they are compared. Perhaps what we see here is a sort of contrast effect. When we say a contrast effect, we usually see this effect maybe in twin studies and other sibling studies as well. So this is a sort of bias in parent report of their children, a tendency to exaggerate differences between siblings. And if you remember, I told you that we will come back to the finding about enhanced empathy in siblings of children with disabilities, and particularly autism. So it could be that this contrast effect is even amplified here. If the parents rate their children's empathic ability and they have another child to compare, they give those scores, they give this rating with their other child in their mind. And if this child is a specifically empathic person, that might affect their judgment on their autistic child behavior or abilities. And I also want to note here that the possibility of a construct effect in parent report, it might be more than a psychometric limitation. It could hint for us for a sort of construct or the way parents perceive their children's abilities. We, of course, had a few limitations in our project, mainly resulted from the fact that this was a secondary analysis of previously collected data. So we had some information missing, for example, age gaps between the siblings, the sex of the siblings, variables that are likely to be quite important, and we know this from other literature on siblings. Those are quite crucial variables, and the quality of the sibling relationship that was not reported or analyzed here. So we do have some future directions for this line of research, and hopefully exploring associations between empathy and aspects of the siblings' relationship, such as warmth, closeness, conflict, relative status power, etc. Of course, incorporate a wide range of empathy measures and informants would be very beneficial to get some more understanding of this topic, and directly examine parents' perspectives on their autistic children's empathic abilities. So, to sum up, empathy is shaped by various aspects of siblinghood in autistic individuals in similar ways as it does for non-autistic individuals. Growing up with a sibling not only matters for empathy in autistic individuals, depending on their sex, but also matters for how their empathic abilities are perceived by their parents. And we think that this possible bias in parental perception should be considered both in research and in clinical and educational work with autistic individuals and their families. So that's, I think, the main take-home message. I thank you all for your attention, and I also take this opportunity to thank the people and the institution that helped me to come back here. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
You mean the adult? You mean the adult data?
And in the children's data, there was less, so it's even
It's like the other way around.
But another really important question I think here is older siblings versus younger siblings.
So we did in the children's. Yes. So that's an important question. I noted, but I'll emphasize that again. So having older versus younger children is very important to what we see in sibling literature. But here in the children's data, it didn't matter. So if you had older sibling or a younger sibling, you were still rated as having lower empathy than your typically developing sibling. As for the adult data, you are right. We do see no difference overall, but this interaction with sex is not something that came up only in this data set. It repeats also in typical individual literature. We see quite similar, so it might be matters of power, maybe because of the uneven samples we had because we reanalyzed previously collected data. But we do see the same trend of specifically affecting male adult autistic. So we don't see the overall difference, but we do see it specifically for males. Also, it's important to remember that we used those specific 2 measures of empathy, and we can have a full session about these measures alone and what exactly they are measuring. But if you are interested in, for example, a new tool to measure empathy, we will have a poster in the poster session presenting empathic accuracy and empathic synchrony, mainly towards autistic people, and we can continue discuss it there. Florina.
First of all, thank you. It was really fascinating. I want to strengthen your interpretation about the parent report because we have a study in adolescents where we were able to compare parent and self-report, and we see indeed that parents of autistic kids underestimate their levels of empathy, and using the RMET, we showed that children are more accurate in their own reporting. So, that's good.
So we need to have a coffee over that, definitely.
And I wanted to ask whether you looked at who the siblings were. I mean, one of the implications is that it's a typical sibling, right? Is
Yeah.
that something that you should check?
So yeah, it's a very important question. So we excluded other siblings that were reported to be autistic. But we can't promise, is that true, that they were what we call typically developing. So they could have other neurodevelopmental conditions or other conditions. We don't know that. That's one of the limitations of this data set. And I'm sure it will be an important variable. Still, we see in those large numbers this bias in parental report, and I think this is maybe a sort of, I don't know, Pandora box that sometimes we'll have to open to see what we measure, who's the informant, what are the differences, what they might be, but maybe every informant sees the world from a slightly different perspective. It's not to blame parents for not understanding their children. It's just to note that sometimes what the children see or what we see in objective measurements can be very different to what the parents see.
Thank you very, very much.